My name is Christian Raffensperger, and I'm a historian of medieval Eastern Europe. I focus on a lot of different things, but my overarching goal is to talk about the interconnectivity between Rus and the rest of Europe. When I first began learning about Rus, even way back in college, it was revelatory to me to find out that, in fact, medieval Europe was more than just England and France and that the Vikings preyed upon them, but in fact, Rus was part and parcel of a much larger medieval Europe, and this is in the sources, even if it's not in the secondary literature. I began looking into that, and then when I eventually went to graduate school, that's what I wrote my dissertation on at the University of Chicago. And then that became the basis for my first book, Reimagining Europe, which we'll talk about, and actually an appendix of that dissertation, which was a listing of dynastic marriages, became the basis for Ties of Kinship. Ties of Kinship grew out of that, and I like I said, I had this book contract for Reimagining Europe with Harvard University Press. And then I had a 160-page appendix that I didn't know what to do with, but there was a lot of good information in there. And so I began asking around, and David Birnbaum at the University of Pittsburgh suggested I do a digital humanities project with it. And Donald Ostrovsky at Harvard suggested that I talk to the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute about publishing it as a book. And so I pursued both of those, and actually both of them worked. And so we ended up with a book, Ties of Kinship, and a digital humanities project, which is separate from the book, but draws on the same data. And then actually very, very nicely it came together when Serhii Plokhy agreed to fund a mapping project that really tied them together. And so I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But that part of the MAPA project run by the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute really visually demonstrates this interconnectivity of Rus and the rest of Europe that I talk about in all of my work. I was just reading something earlier today for another book I'm working on, and it was talking about the idea of Eastern Europe and the evolution of this idea of Eastern Europe and how so very often these are modern ideas that get read back into the past. And even very good books like Larry Wolff's Inventing Eastern Europe is taking this concept of Eastern Europe and pushing it a little bit farther back. And then Val Kivelson and others have said, well, okay, but there are conceptions that push it even a little bit further back. And I think you're correct. What I would like to do is I'd like to go back and look at the primary source material for instance, the 11th and 12th centuries and see what was going on then. And then let's look at that world and build that world from the primary sources rather than try and construct a world already distorted through the lens of our modern eye. So what I did was I went back to the primary sources, and this is almost entirely a primary source-driven project. And so I went back and I read the Latin sources, and I went back and read the old East Slavic sources and the Scandinavian sources and the Byzantine sources to try and find out what they were saying about these marriages. And only once I had a firm grasp on the connections based upon the primary sources did I layer in some secondary scholarship that talked about whether or not we can accept or not what's going on in those secondary sources. And one of the real problems with that is in knowing that there is going to be a hammer descending in terms of the reviews, because there's always going to be the, well, why didn't you read my article on this? Or, what about so-and-so who's worked on that? And what I really tried to do was circumvent that and go to the primary sources and look at what they were saying to build that picture from the ground up rather than from the top down. And the data's there. The information is there. They talk about those marriages in the sources all the time. In fact, I was just looking for a woman in Spain who works on Iberian royalty, asked me if I knew anything about this Polish princess Rixa, the daughter of Vladislav II, who ends up marrying a king of Castile and Leon. I didn't, and so I went looking, and in fact, she's there. She's in a source, even though many modern scholars say she doesn't exist in any of these primary sources until she gets to Spain. But in fact, she does. And if we just go back and look at the primary sources thoroughly, we see the evidence for the interconnectivity that is lost in the secondary scholarship. In the absence of treaties, and we don't really have a whole lot of documentary treaty kinds of evidence, though there are a few, one of the strongest ways to build bonds between families was through the exchange of kin. And so you would marry your daughter to my son or vice versa as a way to demonstrate the solidarity between the two families for a particular purpose. And there's a whole chapter about this in Reimagining Europe, about these connections that are made and why they're made. And there are a variety of reasons. It can be to make peace. It can be to make war on someone else. They can, as you say, perhaps relate to trading treaties. But largely these are going to be arranged by the parents as a way, and even beyond parents. I mean, they could be arranged by the paterfamilias of a clan who is in fact the uncle or the grandfather or something like that. Sometimes we see intermediaries. Henry IV, the emperor of the German Empire, arranges a marriage between one of his vassals, Henry the Long, a margrave, and the daughter of Vsevolod, our Vsevolod Yaroslavich of Kiev. Honestly, there's not a lot of archival work that's needed for this kind of thing. The documentary basis has been published. All of the chronicles are published. They're published generally in multiple editions from the Old East Slavic chronicles, whether we're talking about the Poviest врем'яних liet, which of course is extant only in a couple of editions from the later period. We can look at the Kievan Chronicle. There's the Novgorod Chronicle, and then there are some later problematic chronicles like the Nikon Chronicle, but all of that's published material. If we move into the Latin sources, that's all been published as well, and one of the wonderful things of the Germans of the 19th century was this mania for collecting and publishing every scrap of material related to German history. And it's all bound and published, and in fact, many of them have been published multiple times, sometimes in good editions. But, initially I was pulling these books off the shelf at the University of Chicago that were, yay big, and they were falling apart. The pages would crumble at the touch because they were from 1830 or something like that. But the material is there. It didn't require very much archival research. It just actually required going back and reading the sources that are there and not existing solely within a silo. And that's the big problem that I have with so much of the secondary literature that's being written today, is people set out from the beginning to investigate the history of a silo, Russia, or even Ukraine, or Poland. And instead, I'm trying to look at a horizontal strata, what's going on across all of medieval Europe, rather than in a particular silo. And in fact, digital humanities, this idea of applying technology to humanities research, is growing. And in fact, there are even teaching positions right now that are being offered in digital humanities. So this is an up-and-coming kind of field. And one of the people who is one of the people growing that field is David Birnbaum, this colleague I mentioned at the University of Pittsburgh. And he is working very much personally as an incubator for all kinds of digital humanities projects, mine included, but also there's one for the Poviest врем'яних liet where he worked on this big codex of it with Don Ostrovsky and others, but it's now all online, and you can then search through that text. You can highlight each line in the paradosis, and you can see multiple different variants of that line. All the things you could get in the 3-volume text published by Serhii is available online. And so he is working very hard on that. For me, I actually have a background in technology. Between college and going to graduate school, I worked for a technology company for 3 years, and one of the things we worked on was databases. And it was largely a web hosting company. But I learned enough about databases to be able to be a little bit familiar. And then it was very straightforward. Once David and I set the project up, he was able to create the outlines of an XML database, which is what we use for the back end of it. And then I entered all of the data that I had into this XML database, and we built it to be relatively robust. We tried to imagine the variety of possibilities that could happen. So the infrastructure is there for further expansion. Even though we only have several hundred people in it, it could grow reasonably and scale very well. All of that projects on the website through non-static web pages. So each time you click on the page, it generates a new. So I had this initial back-end database that I worked on, and there was all this data in there, but it was still all entirely text-driven, even though it was all interconnected. And then when I went to the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute to be a Shklar Fellow in 2013, I had a long conversation with Serhii Plokhy, who had just become the director of that institute. And Serhii suggested a mapping project to actually visually map all of these connections. And I thought that was a fabulous idea, especially when he agreed to spend some money on it. And so we hired the Center for Geographical Analysis at Harvard to do the programming required to create or to at least take that back-end data and project it visually. And so Kostya Bondarenko at HURI worked on creating a map, and then we worked with the Center for Geographical Analysis to project all of those marriages onto the map. And so then if you want to show the results, you can see the entirety of the marriages as one, and then you can step through a variety of different functions when you're looking at the map. You can isolate it by individual, you can isolate it based upon a time period, you can isolate it based upon a geographic point, whether it is the German Empire or Poland or Kiev or Novgorod, any of these various choices, and you can then see the lines on the map that are highlighted. So I wrote 2 articles for the American Genealogist, which is one of the scholarly genealogy publications, and I wrote them with Norman Ingham, who was one of my mentors at the University of Chicago, and Norm has since passed away, but he was not only a scholar of Slavic literature, but also a certified genealogist. And in writing those articles, I became a little bit connected to the American genealogy community. And when they began hearing about Ties of Kinship, and when Ties of Kinship came out, I began getting emails. And I got a whole variety of emails from people all over the United States and a little bit in Western Europe, but most of the people in the United States saying, and they almost all began in a very similar way, as a descendant of Yaroslav and so-and-so, or as a descendant of Vsevolod's daughter who married this person, I want to thank you for this book. But, and then they always had a quibble. They always found something that was wrong in relation to this. And people are interested in their genealogy and they explore it and they're so fascinated by these details. And they knew the stuff, right? They knew the material. And so it was very interesting to have some of those conversations. But yes, these people are still alive and they take pride in that heritage and they trace those connections back and these marriages are documented. A lot of it was method and just like focusing on keeping track of all of the various pieces. Even though I've written this book and I've done the research, still sometimes the people will get all tangled up in my head because there are so many of them and there's all of this stuff. The surprises came when there were situations where I disproved something, or maybe disprove is the wrong word, when I chose not to accept some piece of evidence. For instance, there's a very prominent historian in Toronto, Martin Dimnik. And Martin Dimnik has worked very hard to create a history for Chernihiv and for Sviatoslav Yaroslavich's line, which he feels, probably rightly so, has been maligned in most of the history. But in his work, he talks a lot about some specific marriages that happen. And as I began to dig into the primary sources, what I found was that those marriages typically aren't in the primary sources. Where he's getting a lot of that information is from much later sources that he is accepting as good as the primary sources. And so given some of the constraints I put on myself of what to accept and what not to accept, these marriages, which I had thought were fine, had actually happened, I decided hadn't actually happened, or at least what I wrote in Ties of Kinship is the evidence is this, but it's late, and thus it's difficult to accept that this marriage actually happened. And so I put a lot of question marks, or I think I put a lot of question marks into the history of these marital records that hadn't existed before. Sometimes it is that simple, and other times you have to find out, okay, so we've got this piece of evidence from the 18th century, let's say. So this is very late for 11th century material, but 18th century document says that a Rusian knyaz married the daughter of the Byzantine emperor. Okay, great. This is a pretty clear statement. Now, you have to then go and look at the Byzantine source record and see, is there a record of the daughter of the Byzantine emperor marrying a Rusian knyaz in that same time period? There isn't? Okay, well, maybe this has just been lost. Do we know anything about the daughters of that particular emperor at that time? Yes, we do. We know that emperor had 5 children. We know that he had 3 sons. We know that he had 2 daughters. We know that the sons married these women. We know that the daughters married these men. There seems to be no ambiguity, no lost daughter, no daughter who is marrying off into the wilds of Rus at this particular time. And thus, we have to conclude, or at least I concluded, that in fact this marriage probably didn't happen. Or at least it didn't happen with a daughter of the ruler of Byzantium. And that's one of the things that I suggest in Ties of Kinship, is that the chroniclers of Rus, in fact, inflated somewhat their Byzantine ties. And I start this argument in Reimagining Europe, that they would prefer to be more connected with Byzantium than they were, and thus anyone who comes from Byzantium isn't just a member of a ruling family of Byzantium or an important noble from Byzantium, but is a son of the Tsar or a daughter of the Tsar or a brother of the Tsar in the terminology of the Chronicle. So one of the very first things to know about this period is that it's incredibly underdocumented. Eastern Europe in general is incredibly underdocumented for the 11th and 12th centuries. I could go into the German Empire and I could find sources for every noble family, every monastery of this period kept their own records for everything. And yet there are 0 sources from the 11th century in Rus. There are 0 sources from the 11th century in Poland. And there might be a couple small exceptions, but typically speaking, these are going to be very late things. So, for instance, the Pověst врем'яných, the tale of bygone years that chronicles the 10th and 11th and very early 12th century for Rus, is not even extant until the 13th and 14th centuries. Those are the earliest copies that we have still available. Now, linguists will tell you, and I believe them, that this was written in the late 11th or early 12th century. However, the copies that we actually have aren't written until the 13th or 14th centuries. So there's at least the possibility for some problems to be introduced. Similarly, we don't have a robust record, so there are not multiple tracks of sources. Only in the middle of the 12th century do we begin to see multiple chronicles really telling different stories. And so we will see the Laurentian version of the Chronicle telling a different story than the Hypatian version of the Chronicle. They are focused on different things. And in fact, one of the reasons that I included so many citations in this book, Ties of Kinship, was not just to provide a tool so that the scholars could follow my work, but so that they could also talk about what the differences were in each of the sources. So, for instance, the Hypatian will record things that the Laurentian doesn't, and vice versa. Novgorod will include things that the other two don't. And there's linguists will use a tool called a stemma, which connects the various chronicles and the various chronicle redactions. So how are those chronicles connected? And we can use marriages actually to do something very similar, to see where those chronicles record things, where their interests lie, and maybe why they're not included in some of these other chronicles as well. When the Russians collected all of their sources, what they did was they tried to grab everything related to any East Slavs, and they collected it all in one particular place, which is now known as Ergada, the Rossiyskiy Государственный архив Древних Актов. And some material may, of course, have been destroyed, and perhaps what the father you mentioned talking about some of the sources that potentially were used for Nikon's Chronicle or Nikon's Chronicle, which there is some discussion about whether or not this was material that drew on earlier religious sources or not. There's, in fact, a good deal of debate about whether or not this is material that is created at the time or, in fact, does draw on earlier non-extant sources. However, for the 11th and 12th centuries, we just don't have that much material. We see the beginnings of a chronicle tradition in the 12th century that is beginning to be regional. So Novgorod has its own chronicle, Kiev has its own chronicle, and the work of Martin Dimnik, who I mentioned earlier, he is trying to essentially replace the fact that Chernihiv doesn't have its own chronicle. So they don't have anyone to articulate their family opinion, because that's what these chronicles essentially are, is they are replicating the opinions of a particular family. The main chronicle that we have begins to talk about the Vsevolodovichy, the family of Vsevolod Yaroslavich, and this is the main line of the family, and that's the story that we're getting. My colleague who's in the office next door to me is a medievalist who works on France. And she works with women in the aristocracy in France. And her first book is all about charter evidence that talks about these women who play a very active role in giving land, receiving land, buying things, selling things. And what she was able to do was she was able to go into the archives in France and find all of these charters that document these transactions, and that the women's names are actually included in this charter evidence. And these are not these are not royal women, right? They're clearly not peasant women. They're elites. But she's got hundreds of charters that talk about these women being active just from one particular region in the Loire Valley, where these women are playing a major role in transactions. When we talk about sources, she's continually baffled that I'm working with the Pověst врем'яných liat, one chronicle source, and she has not only multiple chronicle sources, she has the level of these hundreds of charter documents as well. And this is just working in secular sources. If she chose to expand to ecclesiastical sources, all of the monasteries in the region, they kept their own records as well. And we know what each of those monasteries bought because we have the cellarers records. We have what the monasteries read, right? Because we have the records of their library and we have the records of service. But for Rus, we just don't have that material. So as much as I would love to have more people working on Rus, and I think that there should be more people working on Rus, the actual documentary evidence isn't hiding somewhere. It just doesn't exist beyond what we already have. The one new type of source, written source, that is still being discovered are the birch bark documents coming out of the ground in mostly northern Russia, like the Novgorod area. Because the particularities of the climate, what we see are these little strips of birch, right, peeled off of birch trees that are inscribed with messages, and they're short messages, and very often they're messages that are informal messages. You owe me 3 grivnas, pay me or else. Right? Sometimes they're love notes. Sometimes they're drawings that look like they were done by children of somebody on a horse with a sword. We've got all kinds of informal writing practices that are coming out of the ground there. Now, when they first began being discovered, there were only a few of them. And I say a few comparatively because we're talking about, say, 400 over the period 1000 to 1400. So, this is one a year on average. However, this is from a very particular area within Novgorod, and potentially this is only a small portion of what we see. Since those discoveries began being published in the 70s and 80s, we're finding still more of them coming out of the ground, and so we learn ever more about them. And they're being published repeatedly, right? We see new ones coming out all the time, and so we learn little bits of information. Linguists like them because they tell us about some of the individualities of dialect. But honestly, for our purposes, or for the purposes of my book, they don't add very much. They're not talking about elite discourse. This is man in the street kind of communication. And in fact, it's regularly theorized that there are writers and readers at central locations. For instance, in Novgorod, at the conjunction of High and Surf Street, there are booths with somebody who can write these and read these for you, so you can have somebody send a message essentially to someone else. Generally, the people who are literate were going to be monks. And this is true across medieval Europe, though it's not, of course, 100%. But generally speaking, the literate ones are going to be monks, and they're the ones who are writing these things down. And so in a monastery, for instance, in Kiev, we will have somebody who is writing down something. And they could be writing down a whole lot of things, but what is preserved is a particular kind of something. And so we have this monk who is writing a chronicle history. And that chronicle could be based upon records. So, for instance, sometimes in the Pověst врем'яných liat, we have evidence that there is an earlier record being used. For instance, in the 10th century, there are 2 treaties arranged between the Rusians and the Byzantines. And the text in the Pověst врем'яných liat looks just like Byzantine Byzantine treaty language. So it has been theorized, and I think that this is true, that in fact what the chronicler did was he had copies of those treaties and he just copied them into the text. It could also be information firsthand, so the chronicler could be hearing from an informant. There's information in the Poviest that comes from Jan, this Jan the old man, and Jan tells stories, and so this chronicler is adding the stories. But the chronicler is typically sitting at a desk in a room that's called a scriptorium, the writing room in the monastery, and he is writing with his pen, probably a quill kind of pen, using ink, and writing on either parchment or writing on vellum, animal skin, and then that's being preserved over time. There's actually a whole scholarship on writers and readers, and the best book on the subject for Rus is by Simon Franklin. It's about writing in Rus. So I wrote a piece related to ties of kinship that got published in the Washington Post, their Monkey Cage blog, about the Dutch referendum on the EU and Ukraine earlier this year. And what I said was that Rus is in fact part of Europe in the medieval period. Ukraine is part of Europe in the modern period, and this is the way we should be talking about and viewing these things. We shouldn't necessarily let these old ideas of divisions of Europe dictate what we're doing either in my period in the past or in the current period of the present. Putin is trying very strongly to gather all of Rus, its history, its culture, everything for himself and for Russia. And in fact, that's not the case. I'm very careful in my work to talk about Rus, not to talk about Ukraine or Russia or Belarus, which often gets left out. But Rus is in fact the progenitor of all three of those different states. And in the period I'm talking about, it's really one. And then over the course of the 12th century, we begin to see movement into different areas where Vladimir Suzdal in the northeast begins to come into its own and begins to have its own prominence. But Galicia-Volhynia in the southwest is also having its own prominence. And of course, the works of Hrushevsky still stand up to this day as a great narrative of what's going on in that period in those places. It absolutely is a fair question, because that's the big issue. How, if my work is right, that Rus is deeply connected into medieval Europe, what changes? Right? That's the question. What happens? And the answer, I think there is a real answer, is in the 13th century. In the 13th century, I think there are in fact three factors that lead to a division in medieval Europe. One of them is the foundation of Vladimir Suzdal in the northeast, and we see the growth of this area in the northeast that is becoming more powerful, and we see it becoming the center of Rus. Kiev kind of steps aside as the center of Rus because of a variety of issues with internecine warfare and other problems, and Vladimir Suzdal becomes a new center, right? And this is going to eventually grow into to Muscovy at some point, but this is a new center that's farther away. But you can't discount the other two, which are huge factors, and that's the Mongols as one, right? The Mongols invade in the 1240s, and we see the sack of Kiev in 1240. We see the attacks in Poland and Hungary in 1241. But the Mongols, even though they sack Hungary and they sack Poland and they defeat all of these areas, where they park their army is the steppe north of the Black Sea. They subjugate Rus, but Poland and Hungary are left to rebuild. And there are a variety of factors involved with the death of Khan Ogadai and these sorts of things. But for us, what matters is the fact that Rus becomes part of the Mongol world empire and Poland and Hungary don't. And so when the king of Hungary, Bela IV, seeing the Mongols approach, he writes a letter to the Pope. And in that letter, he calls Hungary the gate of Christendom. And he says, we are the gate of Christendom. We have protected Christendom against all of these raiders, and he lumps the Rus in with all of these other raiders, and he is drawing an ideological border as a way to get the Pope to help him. But that border actually is drawn by the Mongols when they take Rus and keep it, but they don't subjugate Hungary. right? So we've got one, a move of power to the northeast, two, the arrival of the Mongols, but then three is this idea also articulated in Bella's idea about Christendom. And even though the Crusades start at the end of the 11th century, there's an evolution in the idea of crusading, or what I talk about as the crusading ideal. We see the Crusades start out as a movement against Muslims, as a way to take back Jerusalem in particular and the Holy Land in general. But over the course of the 12th century into the 13th century, we see pagans become targets with the Second Crusade, and then eventually we're going to see in the 13th century Orthodox Christians become targets of crusade as well. The most famous example of this is in 1204 when the city of Constantinople is sacked by the Fourth Crusade. But we also see this in 1222, for instance, when we see a papal legate begin talking about a crusade against the Rus because they are the wrong kind of Christian. And so this hardening of the idea of Christian, I mean, even in the 12th century, Rus participated on crusades with crusaders. They were active in this venue, but by the 13th century, they are objects of crusade. And so in the 13th century, we're seeing a hardening of ideological boundaries, which really breaks out Latin Europe from Orthodox Europe. And that, combined with the Mongols, combined with a move to the northeast for a big chunk of Rus, is going to lead to a break with Europe. And if you look at the marriages as outlined on that map, you'll see in 1100, there's a host of marriages. So 1000 to 1100, you see a host of marriages with all of medieval Europe. But then if you look at 1100 to 1200, you see that compress. And we're looking mostly at marriages with Eastern Europe, kind of broadly defined Eastern Europe. However, if you were to even search then by city, and you were able to look at Kiev versus Vladimir Suzdal, you would see Kiev has marriages in a broad range of areas, whereas Vladimir Suzdal has a smaller set of marriages that are mostly already within Rus. They're a little bit outside of that, but they're certainly not stretching to the rest of Europe, not even to Central Europe. So once we see this 13th century arrive, we're seeing a break. And it doesn't happen entirely for all of Rus. It happens differently in different areas. For instance, Galicia-Volhynia have strong relationships with the Poles and the Hungarians during that time. They'll eventually be absorbed along with Kiev into this new Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that's going to be created. But this is the breaking period, I think, is the 13th century when those connections begin to fall apart for Rus as a whole. I mean, if we're talking about where people are from and where they get their influences, I think this is one of the ways that we can begin breaking down some of these ideas about nation and identity. If we acknowledge that Yaroslav himself is, he's the daughter of Volodymyr and Ragniada, right? And so, so maybe Yaroslav is Rusian, but then Yaroslav is married to a Swedish princess. So all of Yaroslav's children, if we accept Yaroslav as Rusian and the Swedish princess as Swedish, all of his children are only half Rusian. So Izyaslav and Vsevolod, they're only half Rusian. So we'll take Vsevolod, right? And Vsevolod is then going to be half Rusian and half Swedish, and he himself is going to marry a daughter of the Monomachos family in Byzantium. And so this is a very prominent marriage, and so we'll take her as a Byzantine. So if he marries her, and they have children, and of course their most famous child is Volodymyr Monomach, right? Named, or at least taking a name after his after his mother from the Monomachos clan. Volodymyr Monomach, is now, what would it be? It would be 1/4 Rusian, 1/4 Swedish, and half Byzantine. And this is Monomach, this great hero of Rus. So if we're ascribing national identity based upon birth parents, right, we've taken away his Rusian identity, or at least circumscribed it to just 1/4 of his identity. And then Monomach is going to go on to marry Gita, the daughter of the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, Harold Godwinson, and they will have a child, and that child will be Mstislav, right? And Mstislav, sometimes called the Great Mstislav, who is known, in fact, as Harold, after his maternal grandfather. In Scandinavian sources, they call him Harold. If we get to him, then we say that Mstislav is, boy, what are we at now? Some small portion Rusian, some small portion Swedish, some small portion Byzantine, and then half Anglo-Saxon. So, and this is one of these great rulers of Kiev. So it is actually problematic to ascribe national identity based upon bloodlines in this way, but it is kind of fun to think about because it changes our perception of who these people are. And it also allows us to look at what women bring to the table. By and large, women are parental influences just like today in the medieval period. And so they're going to be bringing their culture to the table. They're going to be bringing their language. They're going to be bringing their ideas. And we see this very clearly in names. Monomach is called Monomach because of his mother. His son Mstislav is called Harold because of his mother. We see it in other places too. When Anna Yaroslavna marries Henry I of France, the Capetians, the French royal family, have a long line of family names, right? They're very clear on what their family names are going to be. And then Henry marries Anna, and all of a sudden the first Philip in French history appears. Right? Why does Philip appear as the name of the firstborn son? Anna. It's her influence that brings this in. And then her subsequent children with Henry revert back to the norm, and we see this same Capetian names. But women have influence through the onomastics, through these names, and that's a way that we can still see that influence because we don't have the information to see inside the house, inside the court, inside the bedchamber to know what else was going on. I mean, if we see another daughter of Yaroslav, Agathia, sometimes known as Agatha, she has been a subject of much contention in scholarship. But I agree with the consensus that she married Edward the Exile, one of the Anglo-Saxon ruling family, and that he then was called back by Edward the Confessor to rule. But in fact, he died before that could happen. And so it was almost the case that a Rusian princess became Queen of England. But in fact, instead, their daughter goes on to become Queen Margaret of Scotland. And then Queen Margaret of Scotland has a daughter who becomes, I'm going to get this wrong probably, but Edith, the ruler of England, who marries one of the Henrys. And so there's this line that we get worked into the English royal family. But marrying out, we already see two Anglo-Saxon royals marrying into the Rusian family. We saw the aforementioned daughter of Harold Godwinson, but also Agatha marrying Edward the Exile. Certainly there are people who could make that claim, but the Romanovs would have trumped that for Russia. And in fact, there are Romanovs who talk about themselves as the person who would be the ruler of Russia if they return to a monarchy. There are Romanovs who absolutely do discuss that. And a colleague of mine at Westminster College, Russ Martin, who has written an excellent book about Muscovite marriage, he is, in fact, a historical consultant to the Romanovs in exile. And so he knows a lot of those individuals and talks with them on a relatively regular basis. So they're going to trump the family that I talk about, which is known alternately as the Rurikids or the Rurikovici, or I call them the Volodymyrovici. Well, and the book is not meant really to be read cover to cover. I had a friend, a historian, Charles Halprin, say, I read it cover to cover, and I thought, oh no, I don't know what's going to come next. And he said, it's really repetitive if you read it cover to cover. And I said, it is. There's one section of the book that details the stories of the dynastic marriages, and that's the first section. And that's the kind that I think you can sit down and you can read, and you can hear the stories about why these marriages happened. And that's really what I wanted to tell, was why these marriages happened and what the sources are for those marriages. It's the second section, this table 5 that you're referencing, that's the more reference section that you can use, and I hope that it will be used, and one of the big reasons I think it's important to write in English is that it will be used by a much wider scholarly community. I want my colleague next door who works on France to be able to look up material and not think, I can't even bother with that whole half of Europe because they don't speak English or French. No, I think the only thing I would add is that even if you don't get the book, you can go and utilize the tools online. The tools online are free and available to use, and these are tools at the MAPPA project at HERE or at genealogy.abduradan.org that you can look at, and you can utilize these tools to investigate a whole variety of things, not just your own personal history, which is, of course, available that you could do, but a variety of historical questions about who was marrying whom, why that city was focused on, why that individual family within the larger clan was focused on. There are a variety of questions that I want other people to take up with this data set.